Well, folks, as you've probably heard by now, the Minnesota Twins have found their man. Yesterday, it was announced that Derek Shelton would be the next field manager for the Minnesota Twins. Now, I know that we are generally familiar with Shelton, but let's take a look at his resume. He's been in Major League Baseball as a coach for nearly 30 years. And then let's take a look at his Pirates tenure before we have a little bit of a reaction to the hiring by the Minnesota Twins. So Shelton's area of expertise is as a hitting coach. That's what he's done for a majority of his coaching career. He started with the New York Yankees before moving into the Cleveland Guardians organization as a minor league coach, and then as the organizational hitting coordinator before making his major league debut as a hitting coach in 2005 with the Cleveland Guardians. He was there until 2009 before moving on to the Tampa Bay Rays, where he held a similar or the same role until 2016. And before he made his way to the Minnesota Twins in 2018, he spent 1 year as the quality control coach for the Toronto Blue Jays. But then he came to Minnesota as Paul Molitor's bench coach, and he was actually retained by Rocco Baldelli in 2019 as the bench coach under Baldelli as well. Of course, he lasted one season before he got the job as the Pittsburgh Pirates manager, which isn't surprising after the historic 2019 season that I think at this point a lot of people might not say Shelton was the reason for that, and they would say, the balls were maybe the reason for that. But regardless, that successful season, that record-breaking season, ended up landing him a job with the Pittsburgh Pirates as their manager. As you're probably aware, his time in Pittsburgh was not pretty. Over his tenure, he had 306 wins and 440 losses, good for a .410 win percentage, never finished above fourth place in the NL Central, and of course, never made the playoffs. In fact, he had 2 seasons with 76 wins, and that's as good as he could do with the Pirates. Now, it wasn't all bad. Of course, they had some nice development. Brian Reynolds is maybe the most underrated baseball all-star, borderline superstar ever. He's never brought up in any sort of conversations as being one of baseball's best outfielders, but perennially he is. Then you have more recently O'Neal Cruz and Paul Skeens, obviously huge pieces to the Pittsburgh Pirates. Skeens, one of the best pitchers in baseball. You can definitely argue that Skeens kind of came pre-developed. There probably wasn't a lot that the Pirates or Shelton had to do for him to become the best pitcher in baseball, but let's give him a little bit of credit. If anything, they stayed out of his way and let him do his thing to become the pitcher he has become. But again, outside of those little wins, there was a lot that went wrong. We already talked about the .410 win percentage. Ke'Bryan Hayes was one of the top prospects in all of baseball and never really developed or lived up to that hype. Henry Davis was a former first-round pick who hasn't been able to live up to that hype. And so there's a lot of bad going on there too. But let's keep one thing in mind. The Pittsburgh Pirates won the World Series in 1976, 1979, somewhere in there, and they have largely been irrelevant since. Outside of 5 or 6 playoff appearances since that World Series title, they have largely been an uncompetitive organization, and that's from the top down. That's because ownership doesn't invest in the club. It's because front office continues to make questionable choices, dealing Garrett Cole, dealing Chris Archer, things like that. And so it's hard to put the onus all on Shelton. Now, he's not completely innocent. You also can't take it that far, but I'm almost just going to take his tenure with the Pirates with a grain of salt. It's not encouraging by any means, but it's also not indicative of what's to come with the Minnesota Twins. And it's ironic how similar the role with the Minnesota Twins is going to be. It's a rebuilding club like the Pirates were in 2020. It has an ownership group that doesn't invest in the club, just like the Pirates. It has a front office that makes very questionable decisions, just like the Minnesota Twins. Now, I do expect Derek Falvey and generally the Minnesota Twins, except the ownership, of course, to be better than what was in Pittsburgh. But it's just interesting that the track record that he had with the Pirates now has to be replicated and improved upon with the Minnesota Twins. Otherwise, you're looking at a guy who might just be here for a few years to kind of see this rebuild partially through, and then they're going to be ready to move on to the next manager for the Minnesota Twins. And so let's talk more about the reaction to that hiring. In the first 24 hours since the hiring was announced, people are generally not a fan of the hire, and you can't blame them. One thing I see a lot is that he's basically Rocco 2.0, which I don't totally disagree with. I mean, after all, even though he started with Paul Molitor, Rocco decided to retain him, which isn't super common when you have a change of managerial. Usually they want to bring in their own guys, but he decided to retain them. They worked together for a year, and then he got the job in Pittsburgh. And in fact, if you look back at his press conference with Pittsburgh and some of his quotes, it sounds a lot like Rocco Baldelli. Very much a player-first type of manager, very open and accepting to analytics, which, let's be honest, whoever they hired, we can pretty much assume they were going to be a very analytic forward type of mind. But again, it's just interesting that you fire Rocco just to hire somebody who he helped develop as a manager. And it just kind of affirms what a lot of people suspected, that, it wasn't really Rocco's fault how everything transpired, but he was just kind of the fall guy. And I would agree that hiring Shelton just kind of confirms that, because you really just hired somebody who shares a lot of the same qualities as him. Now, in one respect, again, from my perspective, I thought Rocco Baldelli did a pretty good job with what he had. And so this could end up being a positive in the long run, but it's just an interesting hire, and one that is rightfully so facing criticism, because it essentially feels like an internal hire, when I think the Twins really could have benefited from an external voice, somebody outside of the organization coming in and establishing their own culture, establishing their own beliefs, philosophies, and methodologies, and everything like that. So really interesting hire from that perspective. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. He spent 5 years with the Pittsburgh Pirates from a wins and loss perspective, with very little to no success. And so let's say that for the next 2, 3, maybe even 4 years, the Twins are kind of in their own rebuild and going to be uncompetitive. So after 5 years in Pittsburgh of not winning, and then 3, 4 years in Minnesota of not winning, are they really going to keep him around long enough to see this whole thing through? And additionally, from Shelton's standpoint, if he has 8 to 9 years of losing on his resume, is this maybe the last chance of being a manager that he's going to get? And he's only in his early 50s. So I think on both sides, kind of an interesting fit. Now, I'm one to keep an open mind. So this could work out. I feel like Rocco actually did a pretty good job. And so maybe it's a good thing that we are hiring somebody who was kind of mentored by Rocco. But again, just the kind of the look and feel of it, the optics of it, definitely deserves some criticism. But I would encourage you to remain open-minded as we see this rebuild through, and to really see how he does. In fact, you look at what the Twins needed, and over the last few years, their hitting has been so inconsistent. And so it's that expertise that I will really be interested to see how that works out for the Twins and the development of some of their young hitters. So let me know what you think about the hiring of Derek Shelton as the next Minnesota Twins manager in the comments. Let us know on social media, or visit twinsdaily.com for more coverage.